in a few minutes. In a short time we were off again, and the next place of safety from the shots of the enemy that I recollect of being in was a field of cane or corn to the northeast of the lower batteries. The adjutant to whom I had loaned my horse was killed, and I was designated to act in his place. This charge was ill-conceived or badly executed. We belonged to the brigade commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Garland, and he had received orders to charge the lower batteries of the city and carry them if he could without too much loss, for the purpose of creating a diversion in favour of Worth, who was conducting the movement which it was intended should be decisive. By a movement by the left flank, Garland could have led his men beyond the range of the fire from Black Fort and advanced towards the northeast angle of the city, as well covered from fire as could be expected. There was no undue loss of life in reaching the lower end of Monterey, except that sustained by Garland's command. Meanwhile, Quitman's brigade, conducted by an officer of engineers, had reached the eastern end of the city and was placed under cover of the houses without much loss. Colonel Garland's brigade also arrived at the suburbs, and, by the assistance of some of our troops that had reached housetops from which they could fire into a little battery covering the approaches to the lower end of the city, the battery was speedily captured, and its guns were turned upon another work of the enemy. An entrance into the east end of the city was now secured, and the houses protected our troops so long as they were inactive. On the west, General Worth had reached the Saltillo road after some fighting, but without heavy loss. He turned from his new position and captured the forts on both heights in that quarter. This gave him possession of the upper or west end of Monterey. Troops from both Twiggs's and Butler's divisions were in possession of the east end of the town, but the Black Fort to the north of the town and the plaza in the centre were still in the possession of the enemy. Our camps at Walnut Springs, 3 miles away, were guarded by a company from each regiment. A regiment of Kentucky volunteers guarded the mortars and howitzers engaged against Black Fort. Practically, Monterey was invested. There was nothing done on the 22nd by the United States troops, but the enemy kept up a harmless fire upon us from Black Fort and the batteries still in their possession at the east end of the city. During the night they evacuated these, so that on the morning of the 23rd we held undisputed possession of the east end of Monterey. Twiggs's division was at the lower end of the city and well covered from the fire of the enemy. D and 4th Regiments of Infantry made an advance nearly to the plaza in this way, and with heavy loss. The loss of the 3D infantry and commissioned officers was especially severe. There were only 5 companies of the regiment, and not over 12 officers present, and 5 of these officers were killed. When within a square of the plaza, this small command, 10 companies in all, was brought to a halt. Placing themselves under cover from the shots of the enemy, the men would watch to detect a head above the sandbags on the neighbouring houses. The exposure of a single head would bring a volley from our soldiers. We had not occupied this position long when it was discovered that our ammunition was growing low. I volunteered to go back, to the point we had started from, report our position to General Twiggs, and ask for ammunition to be forwarded. We were at this time occupying ground off from the street in rear of the houses. My ride back was an exposed one. Before starting, I adjusted myself on the side of my horse furthest from the enemy, and with only 1 foot holding to the cantle of the saddle and an arm over the neck of the horse exposed, I started at full run. It was only at street crossings that my horse was under fire, but these I crossed at such a flying rate that generally I was past and under cover of the next block of houses before the enemy fired. I got out safely without a scratch. At one place on my ride, I saw a sentry walking in front of a house and stopped to inquire what he was doing there. Finding that the house was full of wounded American officers and soldiers, I dismounted and went in. I found there Captain Williams, of the Engineer Corps, wounded in the head, probably fatally, and Lieutenant Terrett, also badly wounded, his bowels protruding from his wound. There were quite a number of soldiers also. Promising them to report their situation, I left, readjusted myself to my horse, recommenced the run, and was soon with the troops at the east end. Before ammunition could be collected, the 2 regiments I had been with were seen returning, running the same gauntlet in getting out that they had passed in going in, but with comparatively little loss. The movement was countermanded and the troops were withdrawn. The poor wounded officers and men I had found fell into the hands of the enemy during the night and died. While this was going on at the east, General Worth, with a small division of troops, was advancing towards the plaza from the opposite end of the city. He resorted to a better expedient for getting to the plaza, the citadel, than we did on the east. Instead of moving by the open streets, he advanced through the houses, cutting passageways from one to another. Without much loss of life, he got so near the plaza during the night that before morning, Ampudia, the Mexican commander, made overtures for the surrender of the city and garrison. This stopped all further hostilities. The terms of surrender were soon agreed upon. The prisoners were paroled and permitted to take their horses and personal property with them. My pity was aroused by the sight of the Mexican garrison of Monterrey marching out of town as prisoners, and no doubt the same feeling was experienced by most of our army who witnessed it. Many of the prisoners were cavalry, armed with lances, and mounted on miserable little half-starved horses that did not look as if they could carry their riders out of town. The men looked in but little better condition. I thought how little interest the men before me had in the results of the war, and how little knowledge they had of what it was all about. After the surrender of the garrison of Monterrey, a quiet camp life was led until midwinter. As had been the case on the Rio Grande, the people who remained at their homes fraternized with the Yankees in the pleasantest manner. In fact, under the humane policy of our commander, I question whether the great majority of the Mexican people did not regret our departure as much as they had regretted our coming. Property and person were thoroughly protected, and a market was afforded for all the products of the country, such as the people had never enjoyed before. The educated and wealthy portion of the population here, as elsewhere, abandoned their homes and remained away from them as long as they were in the possession of the invaders. But this class formed a very small percentage of the whole population. The Mexican War was a political war, and the administration conducting it desired to make party capital out of it. General Scott was at the head of the army, and being a soldier of acknowledged professional capacity, his claim to the command of the forces in the field was almost indisputable, and does not seem to have been denied by President Polk or Marcy, his Secretary of War. Scott was a Whig, and the administration was Democratic. General Scott was also known to have political aspirations, and nothing so popularizes a candidate for high civil positions as military victories. It would not do, therefore, to give him command of the army of conquest. The plans submitted by Scott for a campaign in Mexico were disapproved by the administration, and he replied in a tone possibly a little disrespectful, to the effect that, if a soldier's plans were not to be supported by the administration, success could not be expected. This was on the 27th of May, 1846. 4 days later, General Scott was notified that he need not go to Mexico. General Gaines was next in rank, but he was too old and feeble to take the field. Colonel Zachary Taylor, a brigadier general by brevet, was therefore left in command. He too was a Whig, but was not supposed to entertain any political ambitions, nor did he. But after the fall of Monterrey, his third battle and third complete victory, the Whig papers at home began to speak of him as the candidate of their party for the presidency. Something had to be done to neutralize his growing popularity. He could not be relieved from duty in the field, where all his battles had been victories. The design would have been too transparent. It was finally decided to send General Scott to Mexico in chief command, and to authorize him to carry out his own original plan, that is, capture Vera Cruz and march upon the capital of the country. It was no doubt supposed that Scott's ambition would lead him to slaughter Taylor or destroy his chances for the presidency, and yet it was hoped that he would not make sufficient capital himself to secure the prize. The administration had indeed a most embarrassing problem to solve. It was engaged in a war of conquest which must be carried to a successful issue, or the political object would be unattained. Yet all the capable officers of the requisite rank belonged to the opposition, and the man selected for his lack of political ambition had himself become a prominent candidate for the presidency. It was necessary to destroy his chances promptly. The problem was to do this without the loss of conquest and without permitting another general of the same political party to acquire like popularity. The fact is, the administration of Mr. Polk made every preparation to disgrace Scott, or, to speak more correctly, to drive him to such desperation that he would disgrace himself. General Scott had opposed conquest by the way of the Rio Grande, Matamoros, and Saltillo from the first. Now that he was in command of all the forces in Mexico, he withdrew from Taylor most of his regular troops and left him only enough volunteers, as he thought, to hold the line then in possession of the invading army. Indeed, Scott did not deem it important to hold anything beyond the Rio Grande, and authorized Taylor to fall back to that line if he chose. General Taylor protested against the depletion of his army, and his subsequent movement upon Buena Vista would indicate that he did not share the views of his chief in regard to the unimportance of conquest beyond the Rio Grande. Scott had estimated the men and material that would be required to capture Vera Cruz and to march on the capital of the country, 260 miles in the interior. He was promised all he asked and seemed to have not only the confidence of the president, but his sincere good wishes. The promises were all broken. Only about half the troops were furnished that had been pledged, other war material was withheld, and Scott had scarcely started for Mexico before the president undertook to supersede him by the appointment of Senator Thomas H. Benton as lieutenant general. This being refused by Congress, the president asked legislative authority to place a junior over a senior of the same grade, with the view of appointing Benton to the rank of major general and then placing him in command of the army, but Congress failed to accede to this proposition as well, and Scott remained in command. But every general appointed to serve under him was politically opposed to the chief, and several were personally hostile. General Scott reached Brazos Santiago, or Point Isabel, at the mouth of the Rio Grande, late in December 1846, and proceeded at once up the river to Camargo, where he had written General Taylor to meet him. Taylor, however, had gone to or towards Tampico for the purpose of establishing a post there. He had started on this march before he was aware of General Scott being in the country. Under these circumstances, Scott had to issue his orders designating the troops to be withdrawn from Taylor without the personal consultation he had expected to hold with his subordinate. General Taylor's victory at Buena Vista, February 22nd, 23rd and 24th, 1847, with an army composed almost entirely of volunteers who had not been in battle before, and over a vastly superior force numerically, made his nomination for the presidency by the Whigs a foregone conclusion. He was nominated and elected in 1848. I believe that he sincerely regretted this turn in his fortunes, preferring the peace afforded by a quiet life, free from abuse, to the honor of filling the highest office in the gift of any people, the presidency of the United States. When General Scott assumed command of the Army of Invasion, I was in the division of General David Twiggs in Taylor's command, but under the new orders my regiment was transferred to the division of General William Worth, in which I served to the close of the war. The troops withdrawn from Taylor to form part of the forces to operate against Vera Cruz were assembled at the mouth of the Rio Grande preparatory to embarkation for their destination. I found General Worth a different man from any I had before served directly under. He was nervous, impatient, and restless on the march, or when important or responsible duty confronted him. There was not the least reason for haste on the march, for it was known that it would take weeks to assemble shipping enough at the point of our embarkation to carry the army, but General Worth moved his division with a rapidity that would have been commendable had he been going to the relief of a beleaguered garrison. The length of the marches was regulated by the distances between places affording a supply of water for the troops, and these distances were sometimes long and sometimes short. General Worth, on one occasion at least, after having made the full distance intended for the day, and after the troops were in camp and preparing their food, ordered tents struck and made the march that night, which had been intended for the next day. Some commanders can move troops so as to get the maximum distance out of them without fatigue, while others can wear them out in a few days without accomplishing so much. General Worth belonged to this latter class. He enjoyed, however, a fine reputation for his fighting qualities, and thus attached his officers and men to him. The army lay in camp upon the sand beach in the neighbourhood of the mouth of the Rio Grande for several weeks, awaiting the arrival of transports to carry it to its new field of operations. The transports were all sailing vessels. The passage was a tedious one, and many of the troops were on shipboard over 30 days from the embarkation at the mouth of the Rio Grande to the time of debarkation south of Vera Cruz. The trip was a comfortless one for officers and men. The transports used were built for carrying freight and possessed but limited accommodations for passengers, and the climate added to the discomfort of all. The transports with troops were assembled in the harbour of Anton Lizardo, some 16 miles south of Vera Cruz, as they arrived, and there awaited the remainder of the fleet, bringing artillery, ammunition, and supplies of all kinds from the north. With the fleet, there was a little steam-propeller dispatch boat, the first vessel of the kind I had ever seen, and probably the first of its kind ever seen by anyone then with the army. At that day, ocean steamers were rare, and what there were side-wheelers. This little vessel, going through the fleet so fast, so noiselessly, and with its propeller under water out of view, attracted a great deal of attention. I recollect that Lieutenant Sidney Smith, of the 4th Infantry, by whom I happened to be standing on the deck of a vessel when this propeller was passing, exclaimed, "Why, the thing looks as if it was propelled by the force of circumstances." Finally, on the 7th of March, 1847, the little army of 10 or 12,000 men, given Scott to invade a country with a population of 7 or 8 million, a mountainous country affording the greatest possible natural advantages for defence, was all assembled and ready to commence the perilous task of landing from vessels lying in the open sea. The debarkation took place inside of the little island of Sacrificios, some 3 miles south of Vera Cruz. The vessels could not get anywhere near shore, so that everything had to be landed in lighters or surf boats. General Scott had provided these before leaving the north. The breakers were sometimes high, so that the landing was tedious. The men were got ashore rapidly because they could wade when they came to shallow water. But the camp and garrison equipage, provisions, ammunition, and all stores had to be protected from the salt water, and therefore their landing took several days. The Mexicans were very kind to us, however, and threw no obstacles in the way of our landing except an occasional shot from their nearest fort. During the debarkation, one shot took off the head of Major Albertis. No other, I believe, reached anywhere near the same distance. On the 9th of March, the troops were landed, and the investment of Vera Cruz, from the Gulf of Mexico south of the city to the Gulf again on the north, was soon and easily effected. The landing of stores was continued until everything was got ashore. Vera Cruz, at the time of which I write, and up to 1880, was a walled city. The wall extended from the water's edge south of the town to the water again on the north. There were fortifications at intervals along the line and at the angles. In front of the city, and on an island half a mile out in the Gulf, stands San Juan de Ulloa, an enclosed fortification of large dimensions and great strength for that period. Against artillery of the present day, the land forts and walls would prove elements of weakness rather than strength. After the invading army had established their camps out of range of the fire from the city, batteries were established, under cover of night, far to the front of the line where the troops lay. These batteries were entrenched, and the approaches sufficiently protected. If a sortie had been made at any time by the Mexicans, the men serving the batteries could have been quickly reinforced without great exposure to the fire from the enemy's main line. No serious attempt was made to capture the batteries or to drive our troops away. The siege continued with brisk firing on our side till the 27th of March, by which time a considerable breach had been made in the wall surrounding the city. Upon this, General Morales, who was governor of both the city and of San Juan de Ulloa, commenced a correspondence with General Scott looking to the surrender of the town, forts, and garrison. On the 29th, Vera Cruz and San Juan de Ulloa were occupied by Scott's army. About 5,000 prisoners and 400 pieces of artillery, besides large amounts of small arms and ammunition, fell into the hands of the victorious force. The casualties on our side during the siege amounted to 64 officers and men, killed and wounded. General Scott had less than 12,000 men at Vera Cruz. He had been promised by the administration a much larger force, or claimed that he had, and he was a man of veracity. 12,000 was a very small army with which to penetrate 260 miles into an enemy's country, and to besiege the capital, a city at that time of largely over 100,000 inhabitants. Then, too, any line of march that could be selected led through mountain passes easily defended. In fact, there were at that time but 2 roads from Vera Cruz to the city of Mexico that could be taken by an army, one by Jalapa and Perote, the other by Cordova and Orizaba, the 2 coming together on the great plain which extends to the city of Mexico after the range of mountains is passed. It was very important to get the army away from Vera Cruz as soon as possible, in order to avoid the yellow fever, or vomito, which usually visits that city early in the year, and is very fatal to persons not acclimated. But transportation, which was expected from the north, was arriving very slowly. It was absolutely necessary to have enough to supply the army to Jalapa, 65 miles in the interior and above the fevers of the coast. At that point, the country is fertile, and an army of the size of General Scott's could subsist there for an indefinite period. Not counting the sick, the weak, and the garrisons for the captured city and fort, the moving column was now less than 10,000 strong. This force was composed of 3 divisions under Generals Twiggs, Patterson, and Worth. The importance of escaping the vomito was so great that as soon as transportation enough could be got together to move a division, the advance was commenced. On the 8th of April, Twiggs's division started for Jalapa. He was followed very soon by Patterson with his division. General Worth was to bring up the rear with his command as soon as transportation enough was assembled to carry 6 days' rations for his troops with the necessary ammunition and camp and garrison equipage. It was the 13th of April before this division left Vera Cruz. The leading division ran against the enemy at Cerro Gordo, some 50 miles west, on the road to Jalapa, and went into camp at Plan del Rio, about 3 miles from the fortifications. General Patterson reached Plan del Rio with his division soon after Twiggs arrived. The 2 were then secure against an attack from Santa Anna, who commanded the Mexican forces. At all events, they confronted the enemy without reinforcements and without molestation until the 18th of April. General Scott had remained at Vera Cruz to hasten preparations for the field, but on the 12th, learning the situation at the front, he hastened on to take personal supervision. He at once commenced his preparations for the capture of the position held by Santa Anna and of the troops holding it. Cerro Gordo is one of the higher spurs of the mountains, some 12 to 15 miles east of Jalapa, and Santa Anna had selected this point as the easiest to defend against an invading army. The road, said to have been built by Cortes, zigzags around the mountainside and was defended at every turn by artillery. On either side were deep chasms or mountain walls. A direct attack along the road was an impossibility. A flank movement seemed equally impossible. After the arrival of the commanding general upon the scene, reconnaissances were sent out to find, or to make, a road by which the rear of the enemy's works might be reached without a front attack. These reconnaissances were made under the supervision of Captain Robert E. Lee, assisted by Lieutenants P.G.T. Beauregard, Isaac Thurthus Stevens, Z.B. Tower, G.W. Smith, George B. McClellan, and J.G. Foster, of the Corps of Engineers, all officers who attained rank and fame, on one side or the other, in the great conflict for the preservation of the unity of the nation. The reconnaissance was completed, and the labour of cutting out and making roads by the flank of the enemy was effected by the 17th of the month. This was accomplished without the knowledge of Santa Anna or his army, and over ground where he supposed it impossible. On the same day, General Scott issued his order for the attack on the 18th. The attack was made as ordered, and perhaps there was not a battle of the Mexican War, or of any other, where orders issued before an engagement were nearer being a correct report of what afterwards took place. Under the supervision of the engineers, roadways had been opened over chasms to the right, where the walls were so steep that men could barely climb them. Animals could not. These had been opened under cover of night, without attracting the notice of the enemy. The engineers, who had directed the opening, led the way, and the troops followed. Artillery was let down the steep slopes by hand. The men engaged attaching a strong rope to the rear axle and letting the guns down, a piece at a time, while the men at the ropes kept their ground on top, paying out gradually, while a few at the front directed the course of the piece. In like manner, the guns were drawn by hand up the opposite slopes. In this way, Scott's troops reached their assigned position in rear of most of the entrenchments of the enemy, unobserved. The attack was made, the Mexican reserves behind the works beat a hasty retreat, and those occupying them surrendered. On the left, General Pillow's command made a formidable demonstration, which doubtless held a part of the enemy in his front and contributed to the victory. I am not pretending to give full details of all the battles fought, but of the portion that I saw. There were troops engaged on both sides at other points in which both sustained losses. But the battle was won, as here narrated. The surprise of the enemy was complete, the victory overwhelming. Some 3,000 prisoners fell into Scott's hands, also a large amount of ordnance and ordnance stores. The prisoners were paroled, the artillery parked, and the small arms and ammunition destroyed. The Battle of Buena Vista was probably very important to the success of General Scott at Cerro Gordo and in his entire campaign from Veracruz to the Great Plains reaching to the City of Mexico. The only army Santa Anna had to protect his capital and the mountain passes west of Veracruz was the one he had with him confronting General Taylor. It is not likely that he would have gone as far north as Monterrey to attack the United States troops when he knew his country was threatened with invasion further south. When Taylor moved to Saltillo and then advanced on to Buena Vista, Santa Anna crossed the desert confronting the invading army, hoping no doubt to crush it and get back in time to meet General Scott in the mountain passes west of Veracruz. His attack on Taylor was disastrous to the Mexican army, but notwithstanding this, he marched his army to Cerro Gordo, a distance not much short of 1,000 miles by the line he had to travel, in time to entrench himself well before Scott got there. If he had been successful at Buena Vista, his troops would no doubt have made a more stubborn resistance at Cerro Gordo. Had the Battle of Buena Vista not been fought, Santa Anna would have had time to move leisurely to meet the invader further south, and with an army not demoralized nor depleted by defeat. After the battle, the victorious army moved on to Jalapa, where it was in a beautiful, productive and healthy country, far above the fevers of the coast. Jalapa, however, is still in the mountains, and between there and the Great Plain, the whole line of the road is easy of defence. It was important, therefore, to get possession of the great highway between the sea-coast and the capital, up to the point where it leaves the mountains, before the enemy could have time to reorganize and fortify in our front. Worth's division was selected to go forward to secure this result. The division marched to Perote on the Great Plain, not far from where the road debouches from the mountains. There is a low, strong fort on the plain in front of the town, known as the Castle of Perote. This, however, offered no resistance, and fell into our hands with its armament. General Scott, having now only 9,000 or 10,000 men west of Veracruz, and the time of some 4,000 of them being about to expire, a long delay was the consequence. The troops were in a healthy climate, and where they could subsist for an indefinite period, even if their line back to Veracruz should be cut off. It being ascertained that the men whose time would expire before the City of Mexico could possibly fall into the hands of the American army would not remain beyond the term for which they had volunteered, the commanding general determined to discharge them at once, for a delay until the expiration of their time would have compelled them to pass through Veracruz during the season of the vomito. This reduced Scott's force in the field to about 5,000 men. Early in May, Worth, with his division, left Perote and marched on to Puebla. The roads were wide and the country open except through one pass in a spur of mountains coming up from the south, through which the road runs. Notwithstanding this, the small column was divided into two bodies, moving a day apart. Nothing occurred on the march of special note, except that while lying at the town of Amozoque, an easy day's march east of Puebla, a body of the enemy's cavalry, 2,000 or 3,000 strong, was seen to our right, not more than a mile away. A battery or two, with 2 or 3 infantry regiments, was sent against them, and they soon disappeared. On the 15th of May, we entered the city of Puebla. General Worth was in command at Puebla until the latter end of May, when General Scott arrived. Here, as well as on the march up, his restlessness, particularly under responsibilities, showed itself. During his brief command, he had the enemy hovering around near the city, in vastly superior numbers to his own. The brigade to which I was attached changed quarters 3 different times in about a week, occupying at first quarters near the plaza, in the heart of the city, then at the western entrance, then at the extreme east. On one occasion General Worth had the troops in line, under arms, all day, with 3 days' cooked rations in their haversacks. He galloped from one command to another, proclaiming the near proximity of Santa Anna with an army vastly superior to his own. General Scott arrived upon the scene the latter part of the month, and nothing more was heard of Santa Anna and his myriads. There were, of course, bodies of mounted Mexicans hovering around to watch our movements and to pick up stragglers, or small bodies of troops if they ventured too far out. These always withdrew on the approach of any considerable number of our soldiers. After the arrival of General Scott, I was sent, as quartermaster, with a large train of wagons, back 2 days' march at least, to procure forage. We had less than 1,000 men as escort, and never thought of danger. We procured full loads for our entire train at 2 plantations, which could easily have furnished as much more. There had been great delay in obtaining the authority of Congress for the raising of the troops asked for by the administration. A bill was before the national legislature from early in the session of 1846-7, authorizing the creation of 10 additional regiments for the war to be attached to the regular army, but it was the middle of February before it became a law. Appointments of commissioned officers had then to be made. Men had to be enlisted, the regiments equipped, and the whole transported to Mexico. It was August before General Scott received reinforcements sufficient to warrant an advance. His moving column, not even now more than 10,000 strong, was in 4 divisions, commanded by Generals Twiggs, Worth, Pillow, and Quitman. There was also a cavalry corps under General Harney, composed of detachments of the 1st, 2d, and 3rd Dragoons. The advance commenced on the 7th of August, with Twiggs's division in front. The remaining 3 divisions followed, with an interval of a day between. The marches were short, to make concentration easier in case of attack. I had now been in battle with the 2 leading commanders conducting armies in a foreign land. The contrast between the two was very marked. General Taylor never wore uniform, but dressed himself entirely for comfort. He moved about the field in which he was operating to see through his own eyes the situation. Often he would be without staff officers, and when he was accompanied by them there was no prescribed order in which they followed. He was very much given to sit his horse sideways, with both feet on one side, particularly on the battlefield. General Scott was the reverse in all these particulars. He always wore all the uniform prescribed or allowed by law when he inspected his lines. Word would be sent to all division and brigade commanders in advance, notifying them of the hour when the commanding general might be expected. This was done so that all the army might be under arms to salute their chief as he passed. On these occasions he wore his dress uniform, cocked hat, aiguillettes, sabre and spurs. His staff proper, besides all officers constructively on his staff, engineers, inspectors, quartermasters, etc., that could be spared, followed, also in uniform and in prescribed order. Orders were prepared with great care, and evidently with the view that they should be a history of what followed. In their modes of expressing thought, these two generals contrasted quite as strongly as in their other characteristics. General Scott was precise in language, cultivated a style peculiarly his own, was proud of his rhetoric, not averse to speaking of himself, often in the third person, and he could bestow praise upon the person he was talking about without the least embarrassment. Taylor was not a conversationalist, but on paper he could put his meaning so plainly that there could be no mistaking it. He knew how to express what he wanted to say in the fewest well-chosen words, but would not sacrifice meaning to the construction of high-sounding sentences. But with their opposite characteristics, both were great and successful soldiers. Both were true, patriotic and upright in all their dealings. Both were pleasant to serve under. Taylor was pleasant to serve with. Scott saw more through the eyes of his staff officers than through his own. His plans were deliberately prepared and fully expressed in orders. Taylor saw for himself and gave orders to meet the emergency without reference to how they would read in history. The route followed by the army from Puebla to the city of Mexico was over Rio Frio Mountain, the road leading over which, at the highest point, is about 11,000 feet above tidewater. The pass through this mountain might have been easily defended, but it was not, and the advanced division reached the summit in 3 days after leaving Puebla. The city of Mexico lies west of Rio Frio Mountain, on a plain backed by another mountain 6 miles farther west, with others still nearer on the north and south. Between the western base of Rio Frio and the city of Mexico, there are 3 lakes, Chalco and Xochimilco on the left and Texcoco on the right, extending to the east end of the city of Mexico. Chalco and Texcoco are divided by a narrow strip of land over which the direct road to the city runs. Xochimilco is also to the left of the road, but at a considerable distance south of it, and is connected with Lake Chalco by a narrow channel. There is a high rocky mound called El Peñón on the right of the road, springing up from the low flat ground dividing the lakes. This mound was strengthened by entrenchments at its base and summit, and rendered a direct attack impracticable. Scott's army was rapidly concentrated about Ayotla and other points near the eastern end of Lake Chalco. Reconnaissances were made up to within gunshot of El Peñón, while engineers were seeking a route by the south side of Lake Chalco to flank the city and come upon it from the south and southwest. A way was found around the lake, and by the 18th of August troops were in St. Augustin Tlalpam, a town about 11 miles due south from the plaza of the capital. Between St. Augustin Tlalpam and the city lie the hacienda of San Antonio and the village of Churubusco, and southwest of them is Contreras. All these points, except St. Augustin Tlalpam, were entrenched and strongly garrisoned. Contreras is situated on the side of a mountain near its base, where volcanic rocks are piled in great confusion, reaching nearly to San Antonio. This made the approach to the city from the south very difficult. The brigade, to which I was attached, Garland's of Worth's division, was sent to confront San Antonio, 2 or 3 miles from St. Augustin Tlalpam, on the road to Churubusco and the city of Mexico. The ground on which San Antonio stands is completely in the valley, and the surface of the land is only a little above the level of the lakes, and, except to the southwest, it was cut up by deep ditches filled with water. To the southwest is the Pedregal, the volcanic rock before spoken of, over which cavalry or artillery could not be passed, and infantry would make but poor progress if confronted by an enemy. From the position occupied by Garland's brigade, therefore, no movement could be made against the defences of San Antonio except to the front, and by a narrow causeway, over perfectly level ground, every inch of which was commanded by the enemy's artillery and infantry. If Contreras, some 3 miles west and south, should fall into our hands, troops from there could move to the right flank of all the positions held by the enemy between us and the city. Under these circumstances, General Scott directed the holding of the front of the enemy without making an attack until further orders. On the 18th of August, the day of reaching San Augustin Tlalpam, Garland's brigade secured a position within easy range of the advanced entrenchments of San Antonio, but where his troops were protected by an artificial embankment that had been thrown up for some other purpose than defence. General Scott at once set his engineers reconnoitring the works about Contreras, and on the 19th movements were commenced to get troops into positions from which an assault could be made upon the force occupying that place. The Pedregal on the north and northeast, and the mountain on the south, made the passage by either flank of the enemy's defences difficult, for their work stood exactly between those natural bulwarks. But a road was completed during the day and night of the 19th, and troops were got to the north and west of the enemy. This affair, like that of Cerro Gordo, was an engagement in which the officers of the Engineer Corps won special distinction. In fact, in both cases, tasks which seemed difficult at first sight were made easier for the troops that had to execute them than they would have been on an ordinary field. The very strength of each of these positions was, by the skill of the engineers, converted into a defence for the assaulting parties while securing their positions for final attack. All the troops with General Scott in the Valley of Mexico, except a part of the division of General Quitman at San Agustin Tlalpam and the brigade of Garland, Worth's division, at San Antonio, were engaged at the Battle of Contreras, or were on their way, in obedience to the orders of their chief, to reinforce those who were engaged. The assault was made on the morning of the 20th, and in less than half an hour from the sound of the advance the position was in our hands, with many prisoners and large quantities of ordnance and other stores. The brigade commanded by General Riley was from its position the most conspicuous in the final assault, but all did well, volunteers and regulars. From the point occupied by Garland's brigade, we could see the progress made at Contreras and the movement of troops toward the flank and rear of the enemy opposing us. The Mexicans all the way back to the city could see the same thing, and their conduct showed plainly that they did not enjoy the sight. We moved out at once and found them gone from our immediate front. Clark's brigade of Worth's division now moved west over the point of the Pedregal, and after having passed to the north sufficiently to clear San Antonio, turned east and got on the causeway leading to Churubusco and the City of Mexico. When he approached Churubusco, his left, under Colonel Hoffman, attacked a tête-de-pont at that place and brought on an engagement. About an hour after, Garland was ordered to advance directly along the causeway and got up in time to take part in the engagement. San Antonio was found evacuated, the evacuation having probably taken place immediately upon the enemy seeing the stars and stripes waving over Contreras. The troops that had been engaged at Contreras, and even then on their way to that battlefield, were moved by a causeway west of and parallel to the one by way of San Antonio and Churubusco. It was expected by the commanding general that these troops would move north sufficiently far to flank the enemy out of his position at Churubusco before turning east to reach the San Antonio road, but they did not succeed in this, and Churubusco proved to be about the severest battle fought in the Valley of Mexico. General Scott, coming upon the battlefield about this juncture, ordered 2 brigades under Shields to move north and turn the right of the enemy. This Shields did, but not without hard fighting and heavy loss. The enemy finally gave way, leaving in our hands prisoners, artillery, and small arms. The balance of the causeway held by the enemy, up to the very gates of the city, fell in like manner. I recollect at this place that some of the gunners who had stood their ground were deserters from General Taylor's army on the Rio Grande. Both the strategy and tactics displayed by General Scott in these various engagements of the 20th of August 1847 were faultless, as I look upon them now, after the lapse of so many years. As before stated, the work of the engineer officers who made the reconnaissances and led the different commands to their destinations was so perfect that the chief was able to give his orders to his various subordinates with all the precision he could use on an ordinary march. I mean, up to the points from which the attack was to commence. After that point is reached, the enemy often induces a change of orders not before contemplated. The enemy outside the city outnumbered our soldiery quite 3 to 1, but they had become so demoralized by the succession of defeats this day that the City of Mexico could have been entered without much further bloodshed. In fact, Captain Philip Kearney, afterwards a general in the War of the Rebellion, rode with a squadron of cavalry to the very gates of the city, and would no doubt have entered with his little force, only at that point he was badly wounded, as were several of his officers. He had not heard the call for a halt. General Franklin Pierce had joined the army in Mexico, at Puebla, a short time before the advance upon the capital commenced. He had consequently not been in any of the engagements of the war up to the Battle of Contreras. By an unfortunate fall of his horse on the afternoon of the 19th, he was painfully injured. The next day, when his brigade, with the other troops engaged on the same field, was ordered against the flank and rear of the enemy guarding the different points of the road from San Agustin Tlalpam to the city, General Pierce attempted to accompany them. He was not sufficiently recovered to do so and fainted. This circumstance gave rise to exceedingly unfair and unjust criticisms of him when he became a candidate for the presidency. Whatever General Pierce's qualifications may have been for the presidency, he was a gentleman and a man of courage. I was not a supporter of him politically, but I knew him more intimately than I did any other of the volunteer generals. General Scott abstained from entering the city at this time because Mr. Nicholas P. Trist, the commissioner on the part of the United States to negotiate a treaty of peace with Mexico, was with the army, and either he or General Scott thought, probably both of them, that a treaty would be more possible while the Mexican government was in possession of the capital than if it was scattered and the capital in the hands of an invader. Be this as it may, we did not enter at that time. The army took up positions along the slopes of the mountains south of the city, as far west as Tacubaya. Negotiations were at once entered into with Santa Anna, who was then practically the government and the immediate commander of all the troops engaged in defence of the country. A truce was signed which denied to either party the right to strengthen its position or to receive reinforcements during the continuance of the armistices, but authorized General Scott to draw supplies for his army from the city in the meantime. Negotiations were commenced at once and were kept up vigorously between Mr. Trist and the commissioners appointed on the part of Mexico until the Sude of September. At that time, Mr. Trist handed in his ultimatum. Texas was to be given up absolutely by Mexico, and New Mexico and California ceded to the United States for a stipulated sum to be afterward determined. I do not suppose Mr. Trist had any discretion whatever in regard to boundaries. The war was one of conquest, in the interest of an institution, and the probabilities are that private instructions were for the acquisition of territory out of which new states might be carved. At all events, the Mexicans felt so outraged at the terms proposed that they commenced preparations for defence, without giving notice of the termination of the armistice. The terms of the truce had been violated before when teams had been sent into the city to bring out supplies for the army. The first train entering the city was very severely threatened by a mob. This, however, was apologized for by the authorities, and all responsibility for it denied, and thereafter, to avoid exciting the Mexican people and soldiery, our teams with their escorts were sent in at night, when the troops were in barracks and the citizens in bed. The circumstance was overlooked, and negotiations continued. As soon as the news reached General Scott of the second violation of the armistice, about the 4th of September, he wrote a vigorous note to President Santa Anna, calling his attention to it, and receiving an unsatisfactory reply, declared the armistice at an end. General Scott, with Worth's division, was now occupying Tacubaya, a village some 4 miles southwest of the City of Mexico, and extending from the base up the mountainside for the distance of half a mile. More than a mile west, and also a little above the plain, stands Molino del Rey. The mill is a long stone structure, 1 story high and several hundred feet in length. At the period of which I speak, General Scott supposed a portion of the mill to be used as a foundry for the casting of guns. This, however, proved to be a mistake. It was valuable to the Mexicans because of the quantity of grain it contained. The building is flat-roofed, and a line of sandbags over the outer walls rendered the top quite a formidable defence for infantry. Chapultepec is a mound springing up from the plain to the height of probably 300 feet, and almost in a direct line between Molino del Rey and the western part of the city, It was fortified both on the top and on the rocky and precipitous sides. The city of Mexico is supplied with water by 2 aqueducts, resting on strong stone arches. One of these aqueducts draws its supply of water from a mountain stream coming into it at or near Molino del Rey, and runs north close to the west base of Chapultepec, thence along the centre of a wide road, until it reaches the road running east into the city by the Garita San Cosme, from which point the aqueduct and road both run east to the city. The second aqueduct starts from the east base of Chapultepec, where it is fed by a spring, and runs northeast to the city. This aqueduct, like the other, runs in the middle of a broad roadway, thus leaving a space on each side. The arches supporting the aqueduct afforded protection for advancing troops, as well as to those engaged defensively. At points on the San Cosme road, parapets were thrown across, with an embrasure for a single piece of artillery in each. At the point where both road and aqueduct turn at right angles from north to east, there was not only one of these parapets supplied by 1 gun and infantry supports, but the houses to the north of the San Cosme road, facing south and commanding a view of the road back to Chapultepec, were covered with infantry, protected by parapets made of sandbags. The roads leading to Garitas, the gates, San Cosme and Belén, by which these aqueducts enter the city, were strongly entrenched. Deep, wide ditches, filled with water, lined the sides of both roads. Such were the defences of the city of Mexico in September 1847, on the routes over which General Scott entered. Prior to the Mexican War, General Scott had been very partial to General Worth. Indeed, he continued so up to the close of hostilities. But for some reason, Worth had become estranged from his chief. Scott evidently took this coldness somewhat to heart. He did not retaliate, however, but on the contrary showed every disposition to appease his subordinate. It was understood at the time that he gave Worth authority to plan and execute the Battle of Molino del Rey without dictation or interference from anyone, for the very purpose of restoring their former relations. The effort failed, and the 2 generals remained ever after cold and indifferent towards each other, if not actually hostile. The Battle of Molino del Rey was fought on the 8th of September. The night of the 7th, Worth sent for his brigade and regimental commanders, with their staffs, to come to his quarters to receive instructions for the morrow. These orders contemplated a movement up to within striking distance of the mills before daylight. The engineers had reconnoitred the ground as well as possible, and had acquired all the information necessary to base proper orders both for approach and attack. By daylight on the morning of the 8th, the troops to be engaged at Molino were all at the places designated. The ground in front of the mills, to the south, was commanded by the artillery from the summit of Chapultepec, as well as by the lighter batteries at hand. But a charge was made, and soon all was over. Worth's troops entered the mills by every door, and the enemy beat a hasty retreat back to Chapultepec. Had this victory been followed up promptly, no doubt Americans and Mexicans would have gone over the defences of Chapultepec so near together that the place would have fallen into our hands without further loss. The defenders of the works could not have fired upon us without endangering their own men. This was not done, and 5 days later more valuable lives were sacrificed to carry works which had been so nearly in our possession on the 8th. I do not criticize the failure to capture Chapultepec at this time. The result that followed the first assault could not possibly have been foreseen, and to profit by the unexpected advantage, the commanding general must have been on the spot and given the necessary instructions at the moment, or the troops must have kept on without orders. It is always, however, in order to follow a retreating foe, unless stopped or otherwise directed. The loss on our side at Molino del Rey was severe for the numbers engaged. It was especially so among commissioned officers. I was with the earliest of the troops to enter the mills. In passing through to the north side, looking towards Chapultepec, I happened to notice that there were armed Mexicans still on top of the building, only a few feet from many of our men. Not seeing any stairway or ladder reaching to the top of the building, I took a few soldiers, and had a cart that happened to be standing near brought up, and placing the shafts against the wall and chocking the wheels so that the cart could not back, used the shafts as a sort of ladder extending to within 3 or 4 feet of the top. By this I climbed to the roof of the building, followed by a few men, but found a private soldier had preceded me by some other way. There were still quite a number of Mexicans on the roof, among them a major and 5 or 6 officers of lower grades, who had not succeeded in getting away before our troops occupied the building. They still had their arms, while the soldier before mentioned was walking as sentry, guarding the prisoners he had surrounded, all by himself. I halted the sentinel, received the swords from the commissioned officers, and proceeded, with the assistance of the soldiers now with me, to disable the muskets by striking them against the edge of the wall and throw them to the ground below. Molino del Rey was now captured, and the troops engaged, with the exception of an appropriate guard over the captured position and property, were marched back to their quarters in Tacubaya. The engagement did not last many minutes, but the killed and wounded were numerous for the number of troops engaged. During the night of the 11th batteries were established, which could play upon the fortifications of Chapultepec. The bombardment commenced early on the morning of the 12th, but there was no further engagement during this day than that of the artillery. General Scott assigned the capture of Chapultepec to General Pillow, but did not leave the details to his judgment. 2 assaulting columns, 250 men each, composed of volunteers for the occasion, were formed. They were commanded by Captains Mackenzie and Casey, respectively. The assault was successful, but bloody. In later years, if not at the time, the battles of Molino del Rey and Chapultepec have seemed to me to have been wholly unnecessary. When the assaults upon the garritas of San Cosme and Belen were determined upon, the road running east to the former gate could have been reached easily, without an engagement, by moving along south of the mills until west of them sufficiently far to be out of range, thence north to the road above mentioned, or if desirable to keep the 2 attacking columns nearer together, the troops could have been turned east so as to come on the aqueduct road out of range of the guns from Chapultepec. In like manner, the troops designated to act against Belen could have kept east of Chapultepec, out of range, and come on to the aqueduct, also out of range of Chapultepec. Molino del Rey and Chapultepec would both have been necessarily evacuated if this course had been pursued, for they would have been turned. General Quitman, a volunteer from the state of Mississippi, who stood well with the army both as a soldier and as a man, commanded the column acting against Belen. General Worth commanded the column against San Cosme. When Chapultepec fell, the advance commenced along the 2 aqueduct roads. I was on the road to San Cosme, and witnessed most that took place on that route. When opposition was encountered, our troops sheltered themselves by keeping under the arches supporting the aqueduct, advancing an arch at a time. We encountered no serious obstruction until within gunshot of the point where the road we were on intersects that running east to the city, the point where the aqueduct turns at a right angle. I have described the defences of this position before. There were but 3 commissioned officers besides myself that I can now call to mind with the advance when the above position was reached. One of these officers was a Lieutenant Semes of the Marine Corps. I think Captain Gore and Lieutenant Judah of the 4th Infantry were the others. Our progress was stopped for the time by the single piece of artillery at the angle of the roads and the infantry occupying the housetops back from it. West of the road from where we were stood a house occupying the southwest angle made by the San Cosme road and the road we were moving upon. A stone wall ran from the house along each of these roads for a considerable distance, and thence back until it joined, enclosing quite a yard about the house. I watched my opportunity and skipped across the road and behind the south wall. Proceeding cautiously to the west corner of the enclosure, I peeped around, and seeing nobody, continued, still cautiously, until the road running east and west was reached. I then returned to the troops and called for volunteers. All that were close to me, or that heard me, about a dozen, offered their services. Commanding them to carry their arms at a trail, I watched our opportunity and got them across the road and under cover of the wall beyond, before the enemy had a shot at us. Our men under cover of the arches kept a close watch on the entrenchments that crossed our path and the housetops beyond, and whenever a head showed itself above the parapets they would fire at it.